My high rise, will you stay wise? Will the slave rise over your eyes, girl? Don't believe those jealous type guys.
Really? Let me go get us some water and stuff. And then Mario's and stuff down there. You sure?
All right.
Got this really hot. Tomorrow it can bust just like a blood shot.
And fade out. All right. Shout out to Brand Nubian, man. God, they've been just tearing it up since what, 91? Sunshine. Folks get found in the sunshine. My life, my life, my life. Anyway, don't let it go to your head. Now let's talk about the topic. Sorry about the kinks, but right, when I come in high D, HD, it'll all be worth it. Anyway, I'm sorry about the delay on the YouTube thing because we're trying to get the HD, but we're working out kinks. But I got some dedicated and competent tech folks here that's we're gonna make it happen, Captain.
I don't know all about competent.
Birth pains. But anyway, today's show is Red Century, 1919 to 2019. We are on the centennial of what is being called, which I think is a historical distortion, the Red Summer of 1919. And the Red Summer of 1919 is basically a summer back 100 years ago, to the day almost, where there were so-called race riots all across the nation. And these race riots started in Chicago, essentially, on the lakeshore, when basically a group of black boys had swam into the white area of the lake where the poor white trash would swim. And prior to those black boys swimming into the poor white trash area of the swimming pool of the lake, there were some other blacks who had came to try to integrate the lake or try to force themselves onto the lake. So the white people were already charged or hostile. And so when they saw these black boys who were not involved in the previous incident, they began to pummel them with rocks, drowned one of the black boys, and race riot essentially ensued. I don't like the term Red Summer 2019 because that is a Eurocentric version of history. Throughout U.S. history, because guess what? The summer of 1919 was red, but the summer of 1818 was red. The summer of 1719 was red. The summer of, in the West, in the New World, in the America, the summer of 1619 was red. And the summer of 2019 is currently red. Since the 1400s, every summer in the United States has been red. It has been said that since the first European arrived to this shore, there hasn't been 48 hours without a murder in this land. And that's not even talking about Africa, again, Asia. That's not even talking about Europe. So why is the summer of 1919 a summer that has survived in the history book? What makes the summer of 1919 redder than the summer of 1918, 1917, or 1920, or 1921, or 1912, or 1819? Why is this summer stand out? What made this summer red, and why we have literally in the history book, Red Summer 1919, as opposed to Red Summer 20, is that 1919 is one of the first instances where black people organized and fought these racists, fought these murderous, homicidal crackers, and fought them back. That's the first time. That's the first time from state to state. There have always been black folks who fought back. If you can find Professor William Mackey's essay, Crazy Niggas, where he said the white folks had this term called a crazy nigga. And a crazy nigga was one who didn't go along with Jim Crow, that would sit wherever he wanted to on the bus, drink out of whatever water fountain he wanted to, and walk in any restaurant and sit wherever the hell he wanted, and bet not no redneck come say nothing to him about it. And being that these racist, homicidal racists are cowards, they would write it off and say, well, he's just crazy. So yeah, we're not going to lynch him. We're not going to drag him into the streets and mutilate his genitals like we would do the average black man that did behave this way, because this is a crazy one. And so he said back in his era, and this happened in his lifetime, he said back in that era, he said those black people that were called crazy were the most sane black people in our communities. And we even took to calling them crazy. Just like now, crazy militant, crazy black nationalists. We still have that tradition of ousting the black folks who the white folks don't approve of. I've experienced that my damn self, personally. You ain't got to go back to 1919, but all of us went crazy in 1919. Black folks got axe handles. Black folks got pistols. Black folks grabbed skillets and said enough. Black people ran up for the first time and snatched a random white boy and beat him to death. That has never happened, even though it happened to us every year. It didn't become a red summer until the white folks got a little taste of what they've been giving us for the last 2 to 3 centuries. Then it became red. But this ain't the first and only time that white folks do this. If you listen to previous Bro Diallo show, you'll see that I broke down there's been at least half a dozen world wars. And the 2 world wars that we count were actually smaller wars than the other 4 world wars to 5 world wars that I identified. If a world war is a major war that spans continents and involves several mobilized nations at war, there have been at the very least, on the modest side, 4 world wars. On a more generous side, at least 6 to 7 world wars that fit the definition of what a world war is. But why does history only count 2 world wars? That's because the 2 world wars, the white folks did the majority of the dying. If white people did the majority of the dying, I don't care if the war spans the entire globe. I don't care if the war goes from the Americas to Australia and hits every nation in between. I don't care if the World War literally caused the utter obliteration of entire races and nations of people. It doesn't get counted as a world war if the white people didn't do the majority of the dying. So the utter extinction of the Arawaks, the Kalinagos, the utter purging of the Easter Islanders, none of that counts because white people didn't do the majority of the dying. And we adopt that. World War I, Hitler was the worst man in history. Hitler is a mediocre murderer. I'm not saying Hitler was justified, but if we're going strictly by body count, Hitler got a lot of catching up to do. But Hitler is the worst. Why? Because Hitler did to white people what white people did to everybody else. He internalized white aggression. Hitler wanted to establish an empire just like Cecil Rhodes, just like King Leopold, just like George Washington. He wanted his empire. But instead of going, he couldn't go to Africa because they had already been to Africa to do their genocide. He couldn't go to America because America was taken. He couldn't go to New Zealand. He couldn't go to Australia. He couldn't even go to India. So he's like, where am I going to go? I'll go to France and colonize. So the French got a minute taste of what they've been doing all across the world for over a century. He said, I go to the east to establish what he called Lebensraum, or living space, or his colony, his Third Reich. And he looked at the United States and said, how did they deal with those Indians? Oh, they put them in concentration camps, but they call them reservations, but it's the same systematic thing. He looked at Great Britain, his other enemy, and said, how did they deal with those Kenyans, those hard-headed Kenyans? He looked at Cecil Rhodes in Rhodesia, aka Zimbabwe, and was like, oh, okay. Hitler was an imitator. Hitler was a Johnny-come-lately, but he's the biggest villain in all of history. Whenever our white folks get to misbehaving, we don't call Trump and say Trump is acting like a Leopold. Trump is acting like a Cecil Rhodes, which had bigger body counts than Hitler. We say Trump is acting like Hitler. They're acting like the Nazis. When the British got a bigger body count than the Nazis had. And the British killed more people over a longer span of time, over a greater amount of territory. But you can fly the British flag. You can I see black people with British flag t-shirts. I've seen black people with the Union Jack tattoo. But you can't touch the swastika. So this is the same thing that we're doing. I was 15 years old when I read The Afrocentric Idea. And I found out there was a such thing as Afrocentricity. And I found that I could look at reality and history and academics from my own African point of view. I don't have to adopt white people's values and give white people's emphasis and value what white people value. I can look at it from what serves my interest. Or basically, I can look at the truth instead of consuming these lies. That's when I was a child. And we got grown scholars that are still pushing this Eurocentric point of view. So Red Summer is a Eurocentric term. We could call it the rebellious summer of 2019. The clapback summer of 2019. But they call it red because white blood was shed. When they were able to mutilate our genitals. Cut babies from the womb of black mothers and stomp them on the ground. When they were able to do that without retaliation, what no Red Summer? Hey, it's just business as usual. But here come a black man with a rusty 38 pistol. Pop! Wow, this is newsworthy. This is a historical event. Because black suffering and atrocities is not worth of history. That's just like oxygen and water. It's everywhere. It's all the time. Something you deal with. You don't even pay attention to it most of the time. So I don't like this term. I'm glad that we're acknowledging the Red Summer. But every year has been red. And guess what? We had red winters, red springs and autumns. Every damn year since 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Every single year since the Europeans crawled out of what Khalid Muhammad would always say, the caves and hills of Europe. Every single year the world has been under what William Bradley called the Kronos complex, aka Western culture and Western aggression. Every year has been a red year. And I know y'all don't like me saying this, but it ain't just been red for people. It's been red for the ecosystem, for the sperm whale and the polar bear. Death everywhere. Everything is dying. There is nothing thriving on the face of the earth besides Bezos' bank account. Nothing is thriving. Nothing is improving. So as we look at the last 100 years, if we want to use the so-called Red Summer as a marker, are African people any more secure or safe? Do white people have any less drive to kill and will to kill, wantonly kill, mutilate, and murder people for no damn good reason? Getting their jollies off, getting their muster, get your muster up. You tell me. Well, I'll tell you. No, they have the same level capacity to harm us as they did in 1919, and we have no more power to prevent or defend ourselves than we had 100 years ago. But before I forget, if you want to understand this, there are 3 books I brought. But I mean, really, I was looking for some books to talk about white aggression in relationship to this Red Summer rhetoric. But it kind of shocked me how many books I had on the topic as I scanned my bookshelves. But I'm like, I'm just going to pick 3. That's the magic number. So I picked 3. One book is called Black Power, White Resistance. It's an old book. Don't ask me to borrow it. but it's called Black Power, White Resistance, and it's basically a collection. And let me hold it up to the camera. If you're listening, Black Power, White Resistance by Qualage, World Press. And this basically talks about black people, and this ain't about, when they say black power, which is kind of a misnomer in this book, they're not even talking about black power. They're talking about black people trying to get a basic education for our people. They're talking about black people trying to get basic housing that is suitable for human occupation. They're talking about black people being able to try to walk down the damn street without being dehumanized. That's what black power is. And white people resisted. White people weren't resisting black people trying to set up a black empire. Black people trying to create a black political enclave or a black economic enclave, or trying to use African currency to undermine or overthrow European currency. When they're saying black power, they're talking about black people just trying to be human beings. And we're getting murdered and our leaders are being assassinated. Our food and water is being poisoned because we're just trying to live. If it was about power versus power, if there was some black elites, some black capitalists, some black imperialists, and they had to fight against the white imperialists, then I'd be like, yeah, that's power versus power. But no, we're talking about mothers who want their children to have proper nutrition and an adequate education. Those women would get murdered and lynched for that. A black woman who goes to the police station and said, listen, my husband went to the neighboring farm and did some labor, and the white man didn't pay him, and he simply said, can you pay me? I got to feed my family. And they murdered him. And then they came and burned down my house, and then they murdered her. That's the black power that white people were resisting, and black power, white resistance. And we need to stop calling things that aren't black power, black power. Black people raising up to be CEOs of corporations. Black people raising up in the ranks of the U.S. military. Black people getting position and status within the oppressive omnicidal system of capitalism is not black power. That's white power in blackface. Obama is not black power. So, Black Power, White Resistance. It's a good read. It tells you more about the mentality of white folks than it tells you about the pursuit of black power. But it's a very good and very well written book. Another book is called, I'm holding it up for the camera, but I'll tell y'all in a second. It's called White Violence and Black Response, From Reconstruction to Montgomery. So this basically deals with the history of emancipation up to the middle to late stages of the civil rights movement. And I marked some passages to read if I can get to it. And this book, the final book on the issue, and this is my, I'll call this my Red Summer 2019 reading list. You know, and I try to get books that really talked, that didn't just like, oh, look how these poor wretched Negroes. Oh, many books on the Red Summer or lynching or racial violence are just like, oh, these wicked white individuals. They don't really do a systemic analysis. Whereas these books talk about systems and politics and agendas, not just the bad races and the poor wretched Negro. So that's why I'm sharing this. This is a book every black family should hold. It's called Without Sanctuary, Lynching Photography in America. This is a coffee table book. And I go to some of y'all houses, y'all got books by, Basquiat. Really beautiful book. That big coffee table book of Basquiat's painting. Some of y'all got Obama picture, this big ass coffee table book of Michelle and Barack Obama going around pretending to be humane people when they're just mass murderers. But this is a book called Without Sanctuary. This is not so much for reading as it is the images. But the introduction to this is very telling. It's very short. The book is 90%, but Without Sanctuary. So this is what I would call the Bro Diallo. 2 books to read, 1 book to look, picture book. With some reading. The Bro Diallo Red Summer reading list. White Violence and Black Response by Herbert Shapiro. The full title is, let me say it if you're trying to write it down, White Violence and Black Response, From Reconstruction to Montgomery by Shapiro. Now, Massachusetts. This book is still in print, so it should be relatively easy to get. This book might be a little harder to get, but y'all are better at me at hunting some of this stuff down. You know, I remember Revolutionary Suicide was like online for like $400, and y'all went out there and I saw people getting it for $20, $30, and so y'all better at sniffing this stuff out than I am. I'm old school. I just walk in the bookstore, and that I ain't as internet savvy when it comes to buying books. I'm still a bookstore type dude. But Black Power, White Resistance by Poland. So that's my reading list. But what I want to say is what's most relevant about that, besides all the stuff I said about us approaching our own struggles, our own atrocities from a European point of view. I mean, we could highlight, you just take a calendar. You take a calendar, take 10 calendars, 100-year calendars, and put them in a blender and reach in and pull out any date, and that date will be red for us. I can point out white atrocities against black flesh on that day. So I think as we mourn the deaths, we mourn the atrocities, we absolutely need to point out the fact that we, white people, are still being pathological, even when they acknowledge their crimes. Because I see the coverage of it, and everyone's acknowledging that it was provoked by whites, and that whites are the bad guys, and that black people were simply acting in self-defense and lashing out after centuries of frustration and repression. They're acknowledging that, but they're not. I haven't seen any public media outlet that states the only thing different about this year and the previous year or the next year is that black people fought back. And guess what? Fighting back helped us. Being nonviolent caused us to suffer. Fighting back increases our level and potential of survivability. Only difference is there were always black people that fought back. Again, those were what Professor William Mackey called the crazy niggas. And again, was his historical term. He wasn't being pejorative. But those were black men lashing out as individuals. Those are black men lashing out based on the direct, immediate issue. During the Red Summer, black people weren't just fighting about that one incident. They were fighting for centuries and decades of white, unmitigated white aggression. So we know Dr. King, I believe, was a true humanitarian, but he was dead ass wrong. He believed that nonviolent resistance would awake white people's moral morality. He believed that if we demonstrated them our capacity to suffer and our willingness to suffer, then they will cultivate in them some empathy and compassion. And again, I'll say, Martin Luther King was getting his head split open for 10 years with no legislation. Go look at the historical timeline. Martin Luther King got his house bombed. Martin Luther King had to stand next to Coretta Scott King, his wife, and she was fine in her day. Go look at them pictures. I mean, not really my type, but I ain't dead. I'm married, but I ain't dead. But if you go look, he had to stand next to Coretta Scott King while some wretched, stinking white woman who hadn't brushed her teeth that morning came and spit in Coretta Scott King's face. And he did nothing. And he thought that that would awaken them. But what had awakened them was the fact that Malcolm X told it. When black people get engaged in organized, directed violence. Not reactionary violence. Not crazy nigga violence. And I don't tear that down. I'm saying that's what Neely Fuller called maximum emergency compensatory justice. When a black person said, I've had it, and I'm going after everything white that ain't right in sight. That's called maximum emergency compensatory justice. There's a thing for that. But that's not revolutionary. That is still reactionary, even though it's justified, even though it's valid, even though we can show those people respect and honor them. We have to understand that's not a revolutionary act. Revolution is direct, non-emotional, targeted, structured, systematic violence. And every time we fight that way, we never lose. And my uncles, I have an uncle who passed away who participated in the 1960s rebellion. It wasn't a riot, it was a rebellion. He said the rebellion was very organized. He said they planned. He said they targeted the business and they went block by block. They knew who to burn and what to burn. They knew who to target and what to target. And he said that was the most organized riot. He said they literally go up one block one week and down the next block the next week. That was organized violence. They took Lyndon Baines Johnson, took his racist cracker ass and sat down at the Oval Office and were like, give me the document. Give me the Civil Rights Bill. Hurry up and let me sign this. Because they were scared that he said that we could do one or two things. We can mobilize our full resources to stop the black rebellion, to repress the black rebellion. But that means we got to bring back troops from Africa and bring back troops from the Caribbean and bring back our troops from the eastern border. That means we, in order to quell American resistance, we have to end the American empire. So he said we can quell the rebellion and thus byproduct liberate the world, or we can pacify the rebels. They chose pacification, which was a good choice. If I was a bloodthirsty, parasitic, racist pig, I would have chose pacification over quelling. But what we take from that is that armed, organized defense, armed, organized direct violence works every time. It has never failed us. Give me an instance in history where it failed us. But going beyond that, if you read Derek Jensen, the Jews who took up arms against the Nazis had a higher survival rate than the Jews who submitted to the Nazis. The African nations that engaged in armed resistance against the British colonizers had a higher survival rate than those who submitted and welcomed the colonizers. The Native American tribes, the hostile tribes, the warlike tribes, the violent tribes had a higher survival rate than the peaceful tribes. It's just a fact of life. The roses with thorns don't get picked as readily as the flowers that don't have thorns. And even when they go to pick the thorns, they got to put on gloves and get those shears and make all those precautions. So if you can't end oppression, make it expensive. Make it costly AF. I don't know why we ignore these lessons of history. We have everything we need to liberate ourselves besides the will, the consciousness, the desire, the freaking love we should have for ourselves and our own self. Okay, well, we don't have everything as I think about the list of things we lack. But none of the things we lack are material. We don't lack the material resources, but the intellectual, the ethereal stuff, which you would think is always harder though. But I digress. The main thing that should stand out to us is that we're still vulnerable. We've had 100 years since the Red Summer to prepare ourselves, to educate ourselves, to arm ourselves, to structure ourselves, so that when white people are ready to go on yet another orgy of mass murder, they would think twice. But the real issue is, y'all remember back in the 70s, this new word emerged in politics and economics called outsourcing, offshoring. Europeans never stopped their orgy of slaughter. They just move around. They had an orgy of slaughter in America, killing black people, mutilating, murdering black folks. And black folks said enough. They were like, okay. So they went to the shores of Tripoli, to the halls of Montezuma. They write about it in their songs. Every time you hear a patriotic song about white people singing about other places, those are places they've committed mass murder and rape. This land is your land, from sea to shining sea. Whenever you hear them naming geography in their patriotic songs, they're talking about places they've committed mass murder, mass rape. Every single song. The plains of Ohio, Go listen to the songs. And then go look at the history. And white folks, I know some white folks, if the few white people still listening, you should fight this too. You need to hear this message too. Because guess what? Let me read Without Sanctuary. I'm going to read from this book. Because we like to think, I always have to say, and I'm running short on time, but I always have to say, when white people got to Africa, when white people got to the United States, when white people got to Asia, when white people got to the Pacific Islands, the archipelagos, when they got to the subcontinent of, when they got there, they were already experts at doing all the things they did. They were master experts at systematic rape, genocide, lynching, psychological warfare, land theft. They were experts at it because Europe was an incubator and a training ground for atrocities. And there isn't one atrocity leveled against the people of the world, the people of color, as y'all used to like to call yourselves. I don't like that term. There isn't one thing they've subjected us to that they didn't subject their own mothers, brothers, sisters, daughters, wives to. Here in Without Sanctuary. I got some other parts. I'm not going to have time to get to it all, but get the books. Or just engage me off of, across social media and we can continue this discussion. But it said lynching was hardly a new phenomenon. For many decades, it has served as a means of extra-legal justice. That's what white folks call mutilating people's genitals justice. And they do. That was literally a crime. You could have a testicle removed for, shooting one of the king's deer. But I digress. Extra-legal justice in the West and Midwest. And most of the victims had been, listen to this, and most of the victims had been white. The first victims of lynching in America were white folks. Where unruly white mobs would go out and grab a white. And and again, as you read, and I don't remember which book it is, I said there's never been an instance of lynching where the victim of the lynching was not sexually assaulted in some way. If not a out-and-out rape, they would be sodomized with an axe handle. Women's breasts would be cut, or they allowed the dogs to ravage the breasts of a woman. There was always a sexual component, sex and violence. They get off on that. Now that we all got the internet, we get a little, but let me not get too graphic. But, sex and violence in terms of Western culture, association, the eros and pathos, the death urge and the life urge marriage. Read Iceman's Inheritance. It's something with white folks. Read Freud. Something with white folks. And white folks, don't get mad at me. Get mad at your ancestors who set this in motion. And get mad at yourself for continuing it. I'm just telling it, and I'm literally reading white people's words here. But I continue to digress. Let's keep going. And most of the victims had been white, along with numbers of American Indians, Mexicans, Asians, and blacks. He sprinkled in some other people, but the primary victims, the first and primary victims of lynching in the United States were white folks. So white people are like, yeah, you think things would be good if you didn't have to give us welfare, if we didn't send the America into economic tailspin because y'all keep giving us food stamps. If you didn't have all these young black boys snatching gold chains and snatching purses, you think America would be a utopia. I'm telling you, the average white person in recent history has not seen internalized white violence. And I tell y'all all the time, white unity is a myth. They didn't come to power because they unified and worked together. And when white folks ain't got nobody else to cannibalize, they start to cannibalize themselves. The violence doesn't end. It often intensifies but that's enough. I've done shows on that. Go back and find the Bro Diallo show, The Myth of White Unity, where we went into that a little more. But let's continue. But in the 1800s, so now remember, they first started coming here in the 1400s. And it wasn't until the 1800s, the late 1800s, literally the 1890s, that black folks started becoming the target of lynching. So they had 400 years of primarily lynching other whites, lynching each other. And I also count like the witch trials when they go get an elderly woman, an elderly herbalist, white woman, elderly, It's people that would do this to their grandmother, and we really think we want to act shocked and taken aback when they do it to us, and they did it to their own grandmothers. With the witch trials. I count the witch trials and all that as lynching too. I mean, but you go all the way back to their very first organized civilized society. Murder was entertainment. We all know about the damn Colosseum. And white people don't have, oh, the Colosseum, that should be a place of shame where you hang your head and feel bad about your culture. They celebrate the Colosseum. But I continue to digress. Let's just read a little more. But back in the 1800s, lynching and sadistic torture rapidly became exclusive public rituals of the South. It moved to the South. The North got a little bit more civilized because it was a little bit more cosmopolitan. Northern whites had a little bit more interaction with other than whites, people of color. So they got a little bit more, or they behaved a little bit more civil. And here's the thing, when they talk about lynching in the South, a lot of white folks would travel to the South to do their lynching. That don't mean Northern whites weren't lynching. That just means they went to the South to do their dirt. Just like the pedophile rings. A lot of, like Jeffrey Epstein, when he found out he couldn't molest girls, where did he go? To Asia, to the Caribbean. So they don't end, they just, what I say, they outsource, right? They offshore. I mean, there's nothing, these people are consistent. Okay, exclusive rituals of the South, with black men and women as the principal victim. During slavery, blacks had been exposed to violence on the plantations and farms where they worked, but when they ventured off the plantation. But it says here, the financial investment each slave represented had operated to some degree as protective shield for blacks accused of crimes. But in the event of an insurrection, real or imagined, whites had used murder, decapitation, burning, and lynching to punish suspected rebels and impress upon all other blacks the dangers of resistance. So when we had economic value to white folks, they would still abuse us, but they were least likely to engage in wanton murder. But as soon as we lose our economic standing. But if you look at economic historians, the honest ones, the radical ones, you'll see that they say, under capitalism, any population that loses its economic niche becomes subjected to genocide. So we think we can end lynching when they were doing this to their own family. And so just as they did when it became, when the North, during the era of chattel slavery, in the North, and then in the after the 1800s, that was a cosmopolitan city. They were doing trade, Wall Street. So they were like, we have to move our lynching down south. For a time, the South was the third world, was an expanse, and the West was the expanse of the U.S. empire. But once all of America came under the rule of law, air quotes, they moved the lynching. Now they're in Haiti lynching our people. They got AFRICOM. They're in the Afghanistan. We are getting reports. New York Times is reporting. This ain't from some wide-eyed black militant. The New York Times is reporting U.S. soldiers and U.S. mercenaries that will just one night of playing dominoes in the barracks decides to posse up and go find a little Arab boy or a little Arab girl or an old Arab man. It don't matter. All you need is somebody isolated and vulnerable. And they begin the humiliation, the torture, the sexual assault, and eventual murder. And then what do? They collect trophies. We literally have U.S. soldiers coming back to America's shores with jars of formaldehyde that have ears and noses and vagina lips and testicles. And some of you white folks that live in the wonderful white communities that call the police when you see a black man just walking through or a black woman just strolling through, some of y'all neighbors in their basement, in their private collection. You go to their barbecue, and when they get a little drunk, they'll show you the mutilated body parts of people from around the world. Ain't nothing changed. Nothing has changed. So we are still as vulnerable. In 100 years, we have not secured ourselves. And let me tell you, what you see America doing at home, they will do abroad. And what you see the United States doing abroad, it will bring home. So even if you think you got your American citizenship, you got your social security number, and you are a full-fledged American citizen, so you think you ain't got to worry about the atrocities at the borders. You got another thing coming. It all goes in cycles. And if you live in Africa and you'll say, hey, I'm a good Kenyan, I ain't got to worry about the racism of America, and that's a black American problem. You got another thing coming. This is a global system of oppression, and we need a globalized system of resistance, and we are 100 years late. Get a late pass, and let's make this revolution. Let's arm our equip ourselves. Intellectual ammunition and the other kind of ammunition. Let's prepare. We didn't start this war, but we have to properly engage it for our best interest. Bro Diallo Show, Q4 Radio. Go to the YouTube, like and subscribe, become a Patreon, make a donation, all of that stuff. You know what you got to do. But I have to wrap this up for our next exciting jazz show. I got to get more details about it. I listened to the show, but I got to get more details so I can tell you, you know, I love to see black folks sustaining our own stuff. I hate having to go to other people to find our cultural products. So please stay tuned to Q4 for the next following show where they're going to have some live local Chicago musicians in right here in the studio, you know, to kind of, you know, invigorate us. Every revolution has had a cultural component. We need revolutionary culture, revolutionary music, revolutionary art, and revolutionary scholarship to carry out revolution on the ground, material revolution. Again, sorry for the technical difficulties at the beginning of the show. I will see you guys Wednesday morning, Friday morning, and so on and so forth. I really missed everyone in the absence. I'm really happy to be back. Please do what you can. I really appreciate all my listeners, even my passive listeners, but I need people to be active listeners. Do what you can to share the show. Go to diallokenyatta.com and share the links and help get the word out, because ain't no corporation gonna give me no kind of sponsorship. So this is the people's show, and it will thrive as the people engage, or it will falter as the people disengage. It's up to y'all. I work for y'all, and I will see y'all again Wednesday morning, Q4 Radio, AM 1680, TuneIn app, iTunes Radio, and of course, as always, q4.org. Oh, I didn't stop. Sorry.